We often define government as a purely mechanical system. We think of it as a collection of institutions, elections, bureaucratic offices, and courts. But this structural view is incomplete. It ignores the hidden ideas that dictate how these institutions actually operate. John Maynard Keynes observed that practical men, who believe they are exempt from intellectual influences, are usually the slaves of some defunct academic scribbler. Political philosophy is the discipline designed to uncover exactly what those scribblers wrote. It is the oldest of the social sciences, built to expose the conceptual foundations of our societies. It asks the permanent questions underlying any structure. What is justice? What are the limits of our obligation to obey the law? What constitutes a decent society? To understand our current political reality, we must look past the bureaucratic machinery and examine the philosophical blueprint of society itself. This requires us to answer the oldest and most critical question: what is a regime? To the ancient Greeks, the regime, the politia, represented more than the government in power. A regime is the comprehensive political, moral, and cultural order of a society. It is the specific way a society is politically organized and morally shaped. To evaluate any society, we must analyze its structural matrix, its cultural ethos, and the tension between a good citizen and a good human being. Because a regime encompasses the total way of life, it aims to produce a specific type of citizen with distinctive traits and loyalties. Classical political philosophy classifies regimes by starting with a straightforward mechanical question: who rules? This matrix charts an axis of power, divided into rule by one, the few, and the many. But the ancients added a second metric, intent, distinguishing rulers operating for the common good versus those operating for selfish interests. When rule by one is virtuous, you have a monarchy. When it degrades, it becomes a tyranny. Rule by the few aimed at human excellence is an aristocracy. When a small group rules for their own wealth, it becomes an oligarchy. Finally, rule by the many through equal political rights is a democracy. Left unchecked, it can fracture into populism or mob rule. The formal arrangement of power is meaningless without understanding the moral intent behind the structure. That moral intent is reflected in a society's ethos, its everyday customs, its religion, and the behaviors it collectively admires. A regime acts as an engine that nurtures specific human character types. Alexis de Tocqueville observed that American democracy depends on informal habits like civic debate, public participation, and tolerance. These customs sustain the regime alongside its formal voting laws. A military regime produces a different character, elevating discipline and strict obedience above all else. An aristocracy produces a culture that praises refinement and excellence, while a theocracy cultivates strict religious reverence. Because of this connection, changing the formal structure of a government eventually alters the psychological character of its people. Because every regime elevates specific values, it inherently rejects others. This makes regimes naturally partisan, both against other nations and within their own borders. The historian Henry Adams observed that as groups compete for power and recognition, politics becomes the organization of hatreds. Managing this friction requires statecraft, the deliberate act of taking intense, competing animosities and channeling them toward a common good. Some thinkers believed political institutions evolved by historical accident, but leaders like Alexander Hamilton argued that good government could be established through reflection and choice. Historical thinkers disagreed on the traits a statesman needs to accomplish this. Plato demanded a philosopher. Machiavelli advised a ruthless pragmatist, willing to act immorally to secure the state. When statecraft fails, these competing factions tear the society apart. But when statecraft succeeds, it binds those factions within a strict legal framework. Avoiding conflict is impossible. A successful regime simply builds institutions robust enough to survive it. Given the dangers of selfish rulers and factional hatred, what is the best practical form of governance today? The modern answer is the constitutional democracy, which draws elements from across the classical matrix. It balances the power of the many, popular consent and participation, with strict legal limits imposed by the rule of law. It uses a physical separation of powers to provide accountability and protects minority rights against the abuses of a majority. Yet, if citizens are uninformed and civic virtue erodes, those legal protections fail and the system degrades back into mob rule. Constitutional democracy is not perfect. It is the safest container we have designed to manage human imperfection. But beyond the mechanics of the state lies an internal conflict for every individual living within it. Aristotle defined by their regime. Their virtue is measured by how strictly they uphold the laws and values of their specific country. A good human being seeks truth and justice universally. Their loyalty is to what is objectively good, regardless of borders. This reality creates a truly terrifying paradox. If a regime is unjust, blind loyalty to its laws makes you a good citizen, but a bad human being. Abraham Lincoln highlighted this exact tension when praising the statesman Henry Clay. Lincoln noted that Clay loved his country partly because it was his own, but mainly because it was a free country. This means the philosopher can never be fully at home in any actual society. Their ultimate loyalty is bound to a standard of justice that does not yet exist. This reveals the ultimate paradox. The best regime serves as a superior standard for all actual governments, yet it has no concrete existence. There is a permanent gap between our messy historical realities and philosophical perfection. This void space between the actual is and the ideal ought is the zone of indeterminacy. This space is the only place political philosophy can exist. It gives us the precise standard we need to measure and correct the flaws in our real governments. Without an impossible ideal to look up to, a society has no metric to realize it is failing. Those who embark on the quest for the best regime often find themselves changed. This study can shift our original loyalties, forcing us to judge our own societies by a higher standard. The ancient Greeks believed this relentless pursuit was driven by eros, by love. By building institutions and crafting civic habits, we attempt to close the gap between the virtue of the citizen and the virtue of the human being. The rigorous study of political philosophy is ultimately the highest tribute we pay to human nature's potential.